There's a moment that comes for everyone who holds power. It's not dramatic. There's no announcement, no ceremony, no transfer of authority. But everyone in the room knows it's happening. The performance is failing. And here's what we never talk about. That failure reveals something we spent decades hiding. Old age doesn't take power away. It does something far more interesting. It makes power visible. For 30 years, we've been taught that power is about confidence, charisma, strategic brilliance. We've watched TED Talks, read leadership books, studied the body language of CEOs and presidents. We've memorized how Jeff Bezos laughs, how Obama pauses before answering, how Sheryl Sandberg sits in meetings. But we've been studying the wrong thing. We've been watching the performance, not the mechanism. Because power isn't what powerful people do. It's what systems do through people. And old age is when the system becomes visible, when the curtain pulls back, when we finally see the scaffolding that was always holding everything up. This is a story about what happens when that scaffolding becomes impossible to hide, about the brutal clarity that comes when bodies fail, but systems persist, about what we learn when we stop watching the magician's hands and start watching the stage beneath their feet. Old age reveals how power actually works, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. July 26, 2023. Mitch McConnell, Senate Minority Leader, one of the most powerful people in America, walks to a microphone to take questions. And then he freezes. Not metaphorically, literally freezes, mid-sentence, for 22 seconds that feel like 22 minutes. The speculation was immediate. What happened? What's wrong with him? Should he resign? But here's what's more interesting than what happened to his body. Nothing happened to his power. He remained Senate Minority Leader. He continued voting on legislation affecting 330 million people. The Republican caucus still looked to him for strategy. His office still controlled which bills came to the floor. The body had betrayed him. The power had not. Dianne Feinstein, in her final year representing 40 million Californians, sometimes didn't recognize colleagues she'd worked with for decades. Staffers had to tell her how to vote. In committee hearings, you could watch them lean in, prompting her, feeding her questions written by someone else. But the votes still counted. The legislation still moved. The power still functioned. Warren Buffett is 94. His hands tremble when he speaks. He repeats himself. He tells the same stories at consecutive shareholders' meetings. He controls nearly $1 trillion in assets. The Pope needs a wheelchair. The leader of 1.4 billion Catholics, the head of a global institution, cannot walk unaided. The church continues. Notice what doesn't happen. The stock doesn't crash when Buffett stumbles. The Senate doesn't stop when McConnell freezes. The church doesn't crumble when the Pope needs assistance. The markets don't collapse when the president forgets a name. The power continues because it was never in the body. We just thought it was.
Watch how we teach people to perform power. Barack Obama's perfectly timed pause before answering a difficult question, the deliberate slowness that signals thoughtfulness. Emmanuel Macron's handshake, the sustained grip, the maintained eye contact, the subtle pull that brings the other person into his space. Steve Jobs in his black turtleneck, standing alone on stage, the uniform that said, "I'm above your conventions." We've built an entire industry around this: executive presence training, voice coaching to lower your pitch and slow your cadence, posture work to take up more space, strategic pausing, power poses. There are $1,000 courses that teach you how to sit in meetings, how to enter a room, how to position your body to signal dominance. And it's all performance. Performance that we mistake for the thing itself. Watch what happens before a president speaks. 40 people adjust lights, test microphones, position teleprompters at precise angles. A speech coach warms up their voice. A stylist checks their appearance. A speechwriter makes last-second edits. Then they walk out alone. And we think we're watching individual brilliance. When a young CEO unveils a product, we see confidence, vision, charisma. We think that's power. 20 years later, that same person can barely read their notes without losing their place. The charisma is gone. The quick wit has slowed. The commanding presence has diminished. The company continues exactly as before, because the performance was never the power. The performance was for us. The charisma makes us believe. The confidence makes us trust. The performance makes us willing to follow. But the actual mechanism with power, the ability to allocate resources, make decisions that affect thousands of lives, move markets, change policy, that's happening somewhere else. It's in the structures, the institutions, the networks, the systems that persist when individual people fade. We've built an entire civilization around teaching people to look like they're in charge. But old age reveals the secret. Looking like you're in charge and being in charge are completely different things. The performance is for us. The power is somewhere else. So, if power isn't the performance, what is it?
So, if power isn't the performance, what is it? Where does it actually live when the curtain falls and the charismatic leader can no longer charm the room? The answer is uncomfortable, because it means everything we've been taught about leadership, about rising to the top, about deserving our position in the hierarchy, it's been a carefully constructed story, a story that benefits from our belief in it. Think about every leadership book you've ever seen. The 7 Habits, Good to Great, How to Win Friends and Influence People. They all share the same premise, that power is a skill you can develop, a trait you can cultivate, a performance you can perfect. And there's truth in that. Performance matters. Charisma opens doors. Confidence creates opportunities. But here's what those books never tell you. Performance gets you into the room. It doesn't explain why you get to stay when you can no longer perform. Watch what happens in the corporate world when a dynamic young executive starts to slow down, when the presentations aren't as sharp, when the strategic insights come less frequently, when age begins its inevitable work. If power was really about individual capability, they'd be replaced immediately. The board would find someone younger, sharper, more dynamic, but that's not what happens. Not always. Often, they stay. They transition into different roles. They become advisors, board members, emeritus positions. Why? Because somewhere along the way, they stopped being valuable for what they could do and became valuable for what they represented, for who they knew, for the relationships they'd built, for their position in the network. This is the invisible transition that happens in every powerful person's life, the shift from performance-based power to position-based power, from what you can do to where you sit, from your capabilities to your connections. And we never talk about it, because acknowledging it would undermine the entire narrative of meritocracy that makes our system feel legitimate. Old age simply makes this transition visible. It accelerates it. It strips away the performance entirely and leaves only the structure beneath. When you see an 85-year-old CEO who can barely stay awake in meetings but remains CEO, you're not watching failure, you're watching the truth. The truth that the CEO was never really running the company alone, that there's an entire apparatus of vice presidents, directors, managers, and assistants who do the actual work, who make the actual decisions. The CEO's job, especially as they age, becomes increasingly symbolic. They sign things, they appear at important events, they lend legitimacy to shareholders and the market. This feels cynical. It feels like we're diminishing the role of leadership, but maybe we're just seeing it clearly for the first time. Because here's the thing, Those vice presidents and directors and managers, they need someone at the top. Not because that person makes every decision, but because organizations need hierarchy. They need clear lines of authority. They need someone whose signature makes things official, someone who can be held accountable, even symbolically. The system doesn't need the person at the top to be brilliant, it needs them to be legitimate, to occupy the position in a way that the entire organization recognizes and accepts. And legitimacy doesn't come from capability, it comes from process, from having risen through the ranks, from being selected by the board, from holding the title, from sitting in the chair that everyone agrees is the chair of power. This is why coups are so destabilizing, not because the person removed was uniquely capable, but because they were removed outside the legitimate process. The system stops recognizing who's in charge because the normal mechanisms of authority have been violated. Old age reveals this because it tests the limits of legitimacy. How diminished can a leader become and still be recognized as legitimate? How much can capability decline before the system stops accepting their authority? The answer varies by institution. Some have mandatory retirement ages, some have term limits, some have no formal mechanisms at all and rely on informal pressure and social norms. But what's universal is this: the leader can decline much further than we'd like to admit, and the system continues functioning, because the system was never dependent on that individual's brilliance in the first place. It was dependent on the infrastructure around them, the people who actually execute decisions, the institutions that persist across leadership changes, the processes that operate regardless of who's nominally in charge. So when we ask, where does power actually live, the answer is in all the places we're trained not to look. In the assistant who manages the calendar and controls access, in the chief of staff who decides what reaches the leader's desk, in the committee structures that make decisions seem collaborative but actually concentrate authority in specific hands, in the unwritten rules about who speaks to whom and whose opinion carries weight. This is the infrastructure of authority, and it's invisible until the person at the top can no longer maintain the performance that distracts us from seeing it. Now, let's look at exactly how this infrastructure operates, at the people who hold the room when the person in charge can no longer hold their own thoughts.
1987. Ronald Reagan is finishing his second term. To the public, he's still the great communicator, confident, in command. Behind the scenes, his staff knows something else. He's repeating himself, getting confused in meetings, sometimes doesn't recognize people he's known for years. Early signs of the Alzheimer's that will be diagnosed 5 years later. But watch what happens, or rather, watch what doesn't happen. The White House continues functioning. Bills get signed. Foreign policy proceeds. The administration operates. How? Howard Baker, his chief of staff, described it later. Every morning, we had to be sure Reagan knew what he was doing that day and why. They weren't briefing him, they were programming him. Nancy Reagan sat in on meetings, not for ceremony, to prompt, to redirect, to remember what he couldn't. And below them, an apparatus of hundreds of people actually writing the policies, making the decisions, negotiating the deals. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her final years on the Supreme Court, was 87, battling cancer, working from home, from hospitals, through treatments. Yet she continued issuing opinions, complex constitutional arguments, detailed legal reasoning. Her clerks, brilliant young lawyers who dedicate a year to working for a single justice, were doing more than research. They were drafting opinions, finding precedents, constructing arguments, presenting options. This is normal, actually. Every Supreme Court justice relies heavily on clerks. But at the end of life, the question becomes, who's actually doing the thinking? Dianne Feinstein's last year, multiple news reports describe the same scene. Staffers have to tell her how she voted on bills just hours before. They brief her multiple times on the same topic in the same day. But her office continues issuing statements, taking positions, negotiating legislation, attending committee meetings. Who's writing those statements? Her legislative director. Who's deciding which meetings to take? Her chief of staff.
Who's determining positions on amendments? Her policy team. Let me show you a single day. March 15th, 2023, 9 a.m. Arrives at office, driven by security detail, escorted by 2 staffers. 9:30 a.m. Committee briefing. Staff pre-briefs her on the briefing. 11 a.m. Committee hearing. Staffers sit behind her, passing notes with questions to ask. 1 p.m. Lunch in office. Scheduler coordinates, dietary needs managed by assistant. 2 p.m. Meeting with California constituents. Staff briefs her on who they are and what they want. 3:30 p.m. Floor vote. Staff tells her how she's voting and why. 5 p.m. Press statement released, written by Communications Director. 23 people touched that schedule, made decisions, represented California's interests, spoke in her name. She was there. She occupied the chair. She cast the vote. But who actually wielded the power? Power doesn't disappear when the powerful decline. It redistributes. It flows to the people in the room who can still execute, who can remember the details, who can negotiate the nuances, who can navigate the system. And here's what's terrifying. Those people were always doing the work. We just couldn't see them. The aging leader is like a photographic developer. They don't change the image. They just make visible what was always there.
2020. Bob Iger, Disney's CEO, is 69. He's trying to retire. He's announced it multiple times. He can't. Not because he won't let go, because the board keeps pulling him back. They try a successor. It doesn't work. They bring Iger back. Why? Is he uniquely brilliant, irreplaceable, or is he something else? The person the system recognizes, the person whose presence maintains continuity, the known quantity in a structure that fears disruption more than stagnation. Markets hate uncertainty. Institutions hate change. Systems prefer maintenance to transformation. Here's the data. Companies often perform better after founder CEOs leave. The metrics improve, the operations streamline, the cult of personality that distorted decision-making fades. But the market punishes the transition anyway, because the market isn't rational, it's emotional, and emotions want familiar faces. The Catholic Church has existed for 2,000 years. It has survived brilliant popes and incompetent ones, political popes and spiritual ones, young popes and ancient ones. The Church doesn't need a particular pope to function. It needs a pope, any pope, to occupy the position. The bureaucracy is what endures, the curia, the College of Cardinals, the administrative structure built over centuries. The United States Senate doesn't need any particular senator to be brilliant. It needs senators to occupy seats, to vote, to provide legitimacy to a structure that operates on accumulated procedure, precedent, and institutional memory. Committee hearings continue whether the senators are paying attention or not. Staff negotiate the actual legislative language. The parliamentary procedures execute regardless of who's in the chair. The most uncomfortable truth about power: the system doesn't need the powerful person to be capable. It needs them to be present, to occupy the chair, to sign the documents, to provide legitimacy. The machinery operates whether they understand it or not. In fact, a diminished leader makes the system more visible. When they can't micromanage, we finally see the actual structure. When they can't dominate every decision, we see who was really making decisions all along. Sometimes the best thing a leader can do is get out of the way while remaining in the chair. Occupy the symbolic position. Provide continuity. Don't interfere with the people actually doing the work. This is how power actually works, not through exceptional individuals, but through systems that make individuals replaceable. The tragedy is we can only see it clearly when the individual has already been replaced by decline.
March 2, 2011. Steve Jobs walks on stage. He's dying. Everyone knows it. He's lost maybe 50 pounds. His skin hangs on his frame.
His voice is thin. Apple stock barely reacts, not because investors think he's healthy, because they need to believe he's still in control. Later reporting reveals Jobs was barely working. Tim Cook was running operations. Johnny Ive was leading design. The executive team was making most decisions. But Jobs had to keep appearing on earnings calls, at product launches, in the mythology, because Apple wasn't selling phones. Apple was selling the belief that an exceptional individual was creating magic. The stock price was based on that story. The brand value depended on it. The entire premium Apple commanded in the market required believing in Steve Jobs. When he resigned, the stock dropped, not because Apple's capabilities changed overnight, because the story changed. Warren Buffett's annual shareholder meeting is a religious ritual. 40,000 people travel to Omaha to hear a 94-year-old man repeat the same value investing principles he's been teaching for 60 years. Berkshire Hathaway could be run by its subsidiary CEOs. The investment decisions could be made by younger managers. Buffett himself has said the company doesn't need him day to day, but the market values his presence at hundreds of billions of dollars, not because of what he does, because of what people believe he does. This creates a trap. Founders who can't leave because their companies are overvalued based on their continued presence, leaders who know they're declining but can't admit it because admission would destroy shareholder value. Tesla trades at multiples that only make sense if you believe Elon Musk is uniquely capable of revolutionizing multiple industries simultaneously. The stock price is betting on his genius, not the company's fundamentals. Remove the Musk premium, and Tesla's valuation becomes indefensible, which means Musk can never fully leave. The company is hostage to his mythology. This is the difference between power that's personal and power that's institutional. Personal power creates fragility. The whole structure depends on one person's continued capacity and mystique. Institutional power creates resilience. The structure persists regardless of who occupies positions. But our economy rewards personal power. Stock markets give premiums to companies with celebrity leaders. Consumers prefer brands with founder stories. Investors bet on individuals, not systems. So we get trapped in a cycle. We elevate individuals, we build mythologies, we create valuations based on the belief in exceptional people, and then those people age, and we can't admit what we're seeing, because admitting it would crash the stock. Power, it turns out, is a kind of mass hallucination, and old age reveals who's maintaining the illusion while the real work happens elsewhere.
Henry Kissinger lived to 100. In his final years, he couldn't walk unassisted. His hearing was failing. His memory was selective. World leaders still sought his counsel. Chinese presidents, Russian leaders, American secretaries of state. They all took the meeting. Why? What was he selling? Not insight necessarily, not brilliant strategy. Most of his advice was obvious or outdated. He was selling access, continuity, the network he'd built over 70 years. A call from Kissinger still meant something, because Kissinger knew everyone, had been in every room, could make introductions, could validate, could connect. The most durable form of power isn't what you can do, it's who takes your call. Look at Davos, the World Economic Forum. Who shows up year after year? Not just the young and dynamic, the old and connected. Corporate boards love aged former CEOs, not for their energy or current knowledge, for their relationships, their accumulated social capital. The same people serve on 6, 8, 10 corporate boards, not because they have time to meaningfully oversee 10 companies, because they know people who know people. The real deals aren't made in boardrooms, they're made at private clubs, in informal dinners, at charity galas where the same circle has been gathering for 40 years. You can be deaf, slow, forgetful, but if you're still in the room, you still matter, because the room itself is the power. A brilliant young strategist might have better ideas, but they can't get the meeting. An aging board member might have mediocre ideas, but their call gets returned. Network science shows this clearly. In any network, the most valuable nodes aren't necessarily the most capable, they're the most connected. Remove a highly connected person, even if they're declining, and the entire network becomes less efficient. Information flows slower, deals take longer, trust breaks down. This is why organizations create positions like chairman emeritus or senior advisor, not because they need the person's work, because they need the person's network. The 85-year-old founder who comes in twice a week can barely use email, doesn't understand the current business model, but knows every major investor, every board member of competitor companies, every journalist who matters. That knowledge, who to call, who owes whom favors, who went to school with whom, who's married to whose sister, can be worth millions. We tell ourselves we live in a meritocracy, that talent rises, that the best ideas win. Old age reveals that's mostly fiction. Access rises, connections win. Accumulated relationships, regardless of current cognitive ability, often matter more than brilliance. One phone call from the right person can accomplish what years of hard work can't. And the right person is often someone who's been around long enough to know everyone. The most durable form of power doesn't decline with age, it compounds. You can't think as fast at 80 as you did at 40, but you know far more people, and in the end, that's often what matters most.
We tell ourselves a story about how power works. Work hard, develop skills, prove your worth, rise through merit. Leadership goes to the capable. It's a beautiful story. It makes inequality tolerable. It makes hierarchy feel fair. And then you watch an 87-year-old senator struggle to remember where she is while making decisions about national policy. You watch a CEO with trembling hands who can't follow a presentation, still controlling billions in assets. You watch the brilliant deputy passed over again for promotion, while the founder's incompetent son becomes VP. And the story cracks. Because if power went to the capable, it would leave when capability leaves. But it doesn't leave, it persists. Sometimes it strengthens, which means capability was never the source. Look at family businesses, dynasties. The son who inherits the company despite being demonstrably less talented than a dozen people in the organization. The daughter who becomes CEO because of her last name, not her resume. This isn't exceptional. This is normal. This is how most wealth transfers, how most power perpetuates. Look at political families, the Kennedys, the Bushes, the Clintons, the Trudeaus, the Le Pens, the Gandhis in India. Is every child of a powerful person uniquely qualified for leadership, or are they inheriting access, networks, name recognition, donor relations, the actual infrastructure of power? Old age makes this visible because the pretense becomes impossible to maintain. When the 90-year-old patriarch is clearly senile, but still nominally in charge while his children run everything, we can see the truth. The person was never the power. The position was, the name was, the network was. We justify inequality by pretending it's earned, that the people at the top deserve to be there, that they're smarter, harder working, more visionary. But watch what happens when their minds fail and they remain at the top. The justification collapses. The meritocracy is revealed as mythology. Power goes to those who occupy positions of power. Capability is optional. Sometimes it's not even relevant. This is deeply uncomfortable, because if power isn't about merit, then what justifies the massive inequality in who has it? If a confused 85-year-old can remain a senator while millions of capable people never get close to that power, what does that say about our system? If a declining CEO keeps control of a company while talented executives are passed over, what does that say about corporate governance? The answer is that we've been asking the wrong question. We've been asking who deserves power, when the real question is what systems create and maintain power structures. And those systems don't care about merit. They care about stability, continuity, predictability, and the preservation of existing arrangements. Old age reveals that individual people don't deserve power. It reveals that power was never about individual people in the first place.
But here's where it gets complicated. Because while old age reveals that individual power is mostly illusion, it also reveals something else. Something we miss when we fetishize youth and disruption. Institutional memory is real, and it lives in people who've been around long enough to see patterns repeat. The 80-year-old senator who's lost a step mentally, but who remembers when Congress tried this same approach in 1985 and why it failed. The aging CEO who can't work 14-hour days anymore, but who lived through the last 3 market crashes and knows what actually works in a crisis versus what just feels decisive. The elderly judge who's slowing down, but who understands how legal precedents evolved because they were there when those precedents were set. This isn't about individual brilliance, it's about having seen the cycle complete. There's a reason monarchies and gerontocracies exist in every culture, not because old people are better, but because continuity itself has value. When everything is changing all the time, someone who remembers what was tried before prevents you from making the same mistakes. When everyone is optimizing for the short term, someone with a longer time horizon asks different questions. Young leaders bring energy, innovation, adaptability. These are real virtues, but they also bring inexperience with the long-term consequences of decisions. Old leaders bring wisdom, not always, not automatically, but sometimes. The wisdom of having seen this before, of knowing that the brilliant new solution was tried in 1973, and here's why it didn't work. The problem is we've set up a false binary: youth versus age, innovation versus tradition, disruption versus stability. The truth is we need both. We need the energy and fresh thinking of youth. We need the institutional memory and pattern recognition of age. What we don't need is the pretense that power belongs in either place because of inherent worthiness. Power should flow based on function, and different functions require different capabilities. Strategic vision and daily operations are different functions. They don't need to be done by the same person. Long-term institutional memory and tactical execution are different functions. They don't require the same age or capability. Symbolic leadership and operational leadership are different functions. They rarely exist in the same person. Old age makes this visible by forcing the separation. The aging leader can't do it all anymore, so the functions distribute. And sometimes that distribution reveals that the system works better when functions are separated. The problem comes when we pretend the 85-year-old is still doing everything, when we maintain the fiction that individual capacity hasn't diminished, when we let one person's decline prevent necessary succession because we can't admit what's happening. The wisdom isn't in preserving aging leaders in positions they can't fulfill. The wisdom is in recognizing what they can still contribute while building systems that don't depend on them. Create advisory roles, elder statesperson positions, places where institutional memory and networks can be accessed without operational control. Build mentorship structures where experience can be transferred before it's lost. Document institutional knowledge so it doesn't live only in aging minds. And most importantly, normalize transition. Make it expected, planned for, celebrated rather than fought. Because here's the final truth old age reveals. We're all going to get there. Everyone who has power now will lose capacity eventually. Everyone who's young and brilliant now will slow down. The question is whether we build systems that can handle that inevitability gracefully, or whether we cling to fictions that make the transition traumatic.
So, if individual brilliance isn't what matters, what does? Let's ask a different question. What makes some power transitions work while others fail catastrophically? The Soviet Union collapsed not when Stalin died. The system survived that. It collapsed when the system itself lost legitimacy, when people stopped believing in the institutional structure. The Catholic Church has survived 2 millennia, not because it always had brilliant popes, but because it built institutional structures that outlast any individual. The United States transfers power every 4 or 8 years, sometimes smoothly, sometimes chaotically. But the transfers that work aren't about the individual leaders being exceptional. They're about the institutions being strong enough to contain the transition. What actually matters is institutional stability, not the leader's charisma. The system's resilience, not the CEO's vision. The company's processes and culture, not the senator's brilliance. The Senate's rules and norms. When those institutions are strong, leadership quality matters less. When they're weak, even brilliant leaders can't save them. This is why some countries with mediocre leaders function well, while others with talented leaders collapse. It's not about the person, it's about whether the institutions work. Old age forces this realization, because you can't pretend the institution depends on the individual when the individual clearly can't do the job anymore, but the institution keeps functioning. Here's what functional power systems actually require. Clear succession planning, not because we know who the perfect next leader is, but because the process of transition is more important than the people involved. Distributed decision-making so that no single point of failure can crash the system. Institutional memory, people who've seen cycles before, who know why certain rules exist, who can provide continuity. Transparent processes, so power can't be hoarded invisibly, so we can see how decisions actually get made. Accountability structures, so that when individuals fail, the system can respond. None of this is about finding exceptional people. It's about building systems that function regardless of who occupies them. The irony is that strong institutions often look boring. They don't depend on charismatic leaders. They don't move fast and break things. They operate predictably, transparently, with established processes. We don't make movies about them. They don't inspire. They just work. But they work when individual leaders fail. They work when people get old. They work through transitions. They work because they're not dependent on any particular person being exceptional. Maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along, not who should have power, but what systems create stable, accountable power structures that function regardless of who occupies them. Old age forces this question, because eventually everyone gets old. You can build a company around a genius founder, but that founder will age, will slow down, will eventually die. If the company only works because of that one person, it's not a company. It's a temporary manifestation of individual capability. The same is true for governments, institutions, any structure that needs to outlast individual human lifespans. The question isn't how to find perfect leaders. It's how to build systems that don't need them.
Watch an aging leader struggle with technology. See the assistants lean in. Notice who actually makes the decision. See the staffers exchange glances. Watch the institution continue. What are you looking at? Not failure, revelation. Every society tells itself stories about power, that it goes to the brilliant, the strong, the visionary, that leaders are exceptional individuals who bend reality through force of will. We need these stories. They make hierarchy tolerable. They make inequality feel earned. Old age is when the stories stop working, when the emperor is too tired to wear clothes, and we finally see what was always there: the tailors, the courtiers, the infrastructure of authority that operates regardless of who sits on the throne. This isn't cynicism, it's clarity.
Because once you see power as it actually works, as systems, relationships, institutions, and networks rather than individual genius, you can ask different questions. Not who deserves power, but what systems distribute it fairly. Not who's the best leader, but what structures create accountability. Not who's most capable, but what processes outlast any individual. Old age reveals how power actually works, and that revelation, uncomfortable as it is, might be the most important thing we can see. Because we're all going to get old, every single one of us, if we're lucky, but the systems will persist. The question is what kind of systems we build while we still can. What kind of institutions outlast us? What kind of processes make individual decline irrelevant to institutional function? What kind of structures create space for both the energy of youth and the wisdom of age, without pretending either deserves power simply for existing? The aging leader with trembling hands signing documents they barely understand isn't a bug in the system. They're the system revealing itself. And once you see it, everything changes. Not because power becomes less real, but because you finally understand where it actually lives. Not in the person in the chair, but in the chair itself. The room it sits in, the people who built the room, the rules that govern who enters, the networks that decide what gets discussed, the institutions that persist when everyone currently in the room is gone. That's power. Everything else is performance, and old age is when the performance finally ends, and the truth becomes impossible to ignore.